1992. A factory floor in Coventry, England. A modified Land Rover rolls off the production line. It is squat, angular, painted military green. The body panels are not steel, they are a laminated composite of glass fibre and polymer resin, bonded into a rigid shell around a strengthened chassis. Men in overalls bolt reinforced transparent panels into the window frames, layer by layer, glass and polycarbonate and bonding film, until the windows are thick enough to catch a rifle round. The vehicle weighs just over 3,000 kilograms. It seats 6, with a hatch in the roof for a machine gun. It looks, to the untrained eye, like a beefed-up civilian 4x4. It looks solid. It looks purposeful. It looks like the kind of vehicle an army could trust. It was designed to stop bricks, and petrol bombs, and 7.62mm rifle rounds fired at close range on a Belfast street. It was never designed to stop a bomb buried in a road in southern Iraq. Over the following 2 decades, 37 British soldiers would die inside it. Their families would spend more than 10 years fighting the British government through the courts, all the way to the Supreme Court, before a defence secretary finally put his apology in writing. Every inquest in every county that returned a verdict on one of those deaths would ask the same question. Why were soldiers still driving this vehicle into a war it was never built for? Its name was the Snatch Land Rover. It became the most hated piece of military hardware in the modern British Army, and the argument about why it kept being used changed the relationship between soldiers, the state, and the law forever. To understand why the Snatch existed, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in 1992. For more than 2 decades, the British Army had been conducting security operations in Northern Ireland under Operation Banner. Soldiers patrolled the streets of Belfast and Londonderry in vehicles that were either completely exposed or protected by nothing more substantial than polycarbonate sheeting bolted to a standard Land Rover frame. Those earlier conversions, known informally among soldiers as piglets, could survive a thrown brick. They could not reliably survive a sustained rifle burst at close range. They offered no protection against the petrol bomb thrown from a second-floor window at a stationary patrol. The Ministry of Defence needed a purpose-built solution. The contract went to NP Aerospace, a Coventry firm with experience in composite armour systems, who worked alongside Ricardo engineers on the drivetrain and structural modifications. They took the militarised Land Rover Defender 110 platform, reinforced the chassis at key load points, and wrapped it in a new monocoque-style composite body. The armour material was constructed from layers of S2 glass fibre, pressed and bonded into rigid panels with a polymer resin. The transparent panels combined layered glass with a hardened polycarbonate backing, held together with polyvinyl butyryl interlayers that prevented shattering on impact. The hull protection system added roughly 800 kilograms to the vehicle's weight. The combat weight came to just over 3,000 kilograms. The powertrain was a 300 turbo diesel engine producing 111 brake horsepower, enough to push the vehicle to roughly 97 kilometers per hour. The operational range was approximately 510 kilometers. A general-purpose machine gun could be mounted through the roof hatch. Later variants allowed fitment of a heavier 12.7mm heavy machine gun or a 40mm grenade machine gun. The program designation used internally was CAV-100 for Composite Armoured Vehicle. In the Army, it took its name from the Snatch Squads, those small groups of soldiers trained to seize ringleaders during civil disturbances. The vehicle and its mission shared the same word, Snatch. 991 were eventually built, in variants designated Snatch 1, 1.5, 2, 2A, 2B, and the later Snatch Vixen. The 2A variant, the type deployed most widely to Iraq and Afghanistan, cost approximately £60,000 per unit. By military procurement standards, that was almost nothing. In Northern Ireland, across the 1990s, the Snatch performed its role adequately. It was not comfortable. The interior was cramped, prone to overheating in slow urban traffic, and the top cover position exposed the soldier manning the roof hatch to a degree of risk that veterans would later describe bluntly. But against bricks, bottles, improvised blast bombs and rifle fire at urban distances, it held. It was the right vehicle for the threat it was built to face. The problem was that the threat it faced next was categorically different. Then came Iraq. In March 2003, Britain committed forces to the invasion of Iraq. Within months, the coalition occupation of southern Iraq had produced a security situation that bore no resemblance to the post-conflict stabilization the planning had assumed. Insurgent networks were active. Attacks on coalition patrols were multiplying. The British Army needed protected patrol vehicles immediately, and the Snatch was the only lightly armoured patrol vehicle available in usable quantities. 208 were deployed into the Basra region by November 2003. The assumption stated nowhere explicitly but embedded in every procurement decision that followed, was that the security situation would resolve before the vehicle's fundamental limitations became catastrophic. That assumption was wrong. Now, before we reach the moment those vehicles started costing lives at a scale that could no longer be managed quietly, if you find this investigation into British military history and equipment failures worth your time, please subscribe. It costs nothing, takes 1 second, and it is the single most effective way to support this channel. In May 2004, insurgent groups in southern Iraq began deploying a different category of weapon, the military-grade improvised explosive device, not the pipe bombs and blast incendiaries used against British patrols in Northern Ireland. These were devices using large quantities of high explosive, often recovered from Iraqi military munition stocks, triggered by radio frequency signals, infrared beams, or simple pressure plates. Later variants used explosively formed projectiles, copper-lined shaped charges that could defeat light armor from directly below. They were designed by engineers, not amateurs. They were placed in culverts, beneath road surfaces, inside dead animals, inside the carcasses of roadside rubbish. They were invisible, patient, and they grew larger every month. The Snatch had no meaningful protection against any of them. The composite armour that stopped a rifle round was irrelevant when 10 kilograms of high explosive detonated beneath the vehicle's flat underside. There was no V-shaped hull to redirect the blast. There was no spaced armour beneath the floor. The vehicle was lifted, rotated, compressed. The people inside were killed by blast overpressure, by fragmentation travelling inward through door seams, by the vehicle itself becoming a weapon against its occupants. On June 28, 2004 in Basra, a roadside bomb destroyed a Snatch carrying soldiers of the 1st Battalion Royal Highland Fusiliers. Fusilier Gordon Gentle, 19 years old, was killed. He was among the youngest British soldiers to die in Iraq. An electronic countermeasure device, a jamming system designed to block the radio frequency trigger used by the bomb, had been allocated to his patrol. It had not been fitted. The inquest, completed years later, found that his death had effectively been avoidable. His mother, Rose Gentle, joined with other bereaved families to found Military Families Against the War, becoming one of the most prominent public critics of the war's conduct. On July 16, 2005, Private Philip Hewitt, 21, of the 1st Battalion Staffordshire Regiment, was killed alongside 2 fellow soldiers when a device struck their Snatch in Alamara. The inquest that followed lasted 3 hours. 3 hours for the death of a British soldier in a vehicle that Ministry of Defence civil servants in both the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development had already begun questioning in their own internal correspondence. His mother, Sue Smith, refused to accept that verdict. She launched a legal action against the Ministry of Defence that would spend 8 years working its way through the courts before reaching the Supreme Court. She argued what the families had been arguing privately for 2 years. The vehicle was inadequate for the threat. The government knew the vehicle was inadequate, and soldiers were still being ordered into it. The Army's informal culture had already reached its own verdict. Soldiers called the Snatch the mobile coffin. According to accounts shared publicly by Philip Hewitt's family, some soldiers deliberately allowed their military driving licenses to lapse to avoid being ordered behind the wheel. These were not acts of cowardice. These were acts of calculation by men and women who had stood at the edge of craters, who understood what the devices did, and who could see clearly that the vehicle they were being asked to drive offered them no real survivability against the threat they faced every patrol. In Parliament, successive defence secretaries defended the continued use of the Snatch on 2 grounds. The first was that heavier, better protected vehicles could not access the narrow streets where much patrolling took place. The second was that placing soldiers in large armoured vehicles would create a psychological barrier between British troops and the Iraqi population, undermining the counterinsurgency approach. Commanders, ministers insisted, had the freedom to make the right vehicle choice for each task. The families replied that this was a rationalisation for systematic underinvestment. The Ministry of Defence had options. It had chosen not to use them. The second theatre made the verdict impossible to contest. In 2006, the main British effort shifted to Helmand Province in Afghanistan. Snatch vehicles followed. The threat environment in Helmand was, in significant respects, more severe than southern Iraq. Devices were larger, more sophisticated, more densely planted, and placed on routes that patrol vehicles had no realistic alternative to using. The ground was harder to read. The insurgency was more experienced at device construction. The Snatch was even less suited to Helmand than it had been to Basra. On June 17, 2008, a Snatch carrying 5 personnel struck a device east of Lashkar Gah. Corporal Sarah Bryant, 26, of the Intelligence Corps, attached to a psychological operations group, became the first British servicewoman killed in Afghanistan. 3 Special Air Service reservists died alongside her. Only 1 person in the vehicle survived. Corporal Bryant's death changed the political temperature in a way that even the accumulation of previous losses had not. The public debate was no longer about whether the vehicle was flawed. It was about why a government that had known the vehicle was flawed for 4 years was still sending soldiers out in it. The answer lay in procurement, and in what procurement reveals about institutional priorities. The vehicles that could have replaced the Snatch were not theoretical. They existed, they were in production, and they were in service with British allies. The South African RG-31 had been built specifically to defeat mines and buried devices, its V-shaped hull directing blast outward and away from the crew compartment. The Force Protection Cougar, the vehicle that would eventually enter British service as the Mastiff, had been in continuous use with the United States Marine Corps in Iraq since 2004. By April 2007, Force Protection could state, with reference to Marine Corps records, that despite more than 300 attacks targeting Cougar variants in Iraq, not 1 Marine had died while riding in one. The V-hull worked. The physics were not in question. The Ministry of Defence had observed Cougar performance from at least 2004. It had considered and rejected the RG-31 on the grounds of size and difficulty of access in urban areas. It had procured a smaller interim vehicle, the Pinzgauer Vector, as a partial alternative from 2007, a decision that produced its own separate scandal when Vector's flat hull and vulnerable seating layout resulted in further deaths, including Sergeant Lee Johnson and Trooper Jack Sadler in December 2007 and Corporal Jason Barnes in July 2008. The Vector was quietly withdrawn. When the contract for Mastiff was finally placed in July 2006, roughly 3 years after the Snatch had first been deployed to Iraq, the British procurement system demonstrated exactly what it was capable of when political pressure reached a sufficient level. The vehicles arrived in Basra in December 2006. The gap between contract signing and delivery in theatre was approximately 23 weeks. That figure became one of the most damning pieces of evidence the families and their lawyers could present. The procurement system could move fast. It had simply chosen not to. The Ridgeback, a shorter and more manoeuvrable variant of the same Cougar family, followed in April 2009. The purpose-built Foxhound, developed by Force Protection Europe and Ricardo, and entering service in June 2012, provided the protection that a Snatch replacement should always have offered. Its monocoque armoured spine and V-shaped crew pod were designed from the ground up around the improvised explosive device threat. It weighed 7.5 tons. It was not a perfect vehicle, but soldiers who rode in it were not dying. Every replacement vehicle procured between 2006 and 2012 was bought through the urgent operational requirement process, drawing on a treasury reserve rather than the core defence budget. That process was designed for genuine tactical emergencies, for situations that could not have been anticipated. Using it repeatedly to procure the basic protected mobility that a deployed army needed was not a sign of a system working under pressure. It was a sign of a system that had failed to do its job while soldiers died in vehicles everyone knew were inadequate. The legal reckoning arrived in June 2013. In the case of Smith and others against the Ministry of Defence, the United Kingdom Supreme Court ruled that British soldiers remain within the protection of the Human Rights Act when deployed abroad. The majority held that combat immunity, the principle protecting government decisions made during active engagement, did not extend to procurement decisions and training choices made before deployment. Lord Hope, writing the leading judgment, noted that soldiers relinquish almost total control over their lives to the state, and that the state carries a corresponding duty of care that does not dissolve the moment those soldiers cross a border. The Ministry of Defence settled the family's claims. The financial terms were not made public. The moral terms were made public in July 2016, when the Chilcot Iraq inquiry published its findings. The inquiry found that the Ministry of Defence had been slow to respond to the improvised explosive device threat, that the continued use of the Snatch should have been recognised as a temporary measure far earlier than it was, and that delays in providing adequate protected vehicles should not have been tolerated. Chilcot did not mince its conclusion. In August 2017, Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon issued a written apology to the families. He acknowledged that decisions taken at the time regarding alternative protected vehicles had caused delay that could have saved lives. The family's solicitor, Jocelyn Cockburn of Hodge Jones and Allen, described the decade of legal proceedings that preceded that apology in a single phrase: delay, deny, and defend. Return to that factory floor in Coventry. In 1992, a vehicle rolls off the production line. It is built for a specific threat, in a specific place, under a specific set of assumptions about what British soldiers would face. The composite armour stops bricks and rifle rounds. The flat underside is irrelevant because no one is planting military-grade devices beneath the streets of Belfast. The vehicle does exactly what it was designed to do. The people building it are not making a mistake. They are building a patrol vehicle for Northern Ireland. What follows is not a failure of engineering. The Snatch was a competent solution to the problem it was given. It had a flat underside with no blast protection. It had composite armour that stopped small arms fire and nothing more powerful. It overheated in the desert. Its weight and dimensions limited the additional protection that could be bolted to it. It offered no survivability against the devices that were being used against British patrols in Iraq and Afghanistan, and for more than 3 years, it remained the vehicle British soldiers were sent out in, while better alternatives sat in service with Allied forces. 37 soldiers died inside it. Dozens more were injured, some catastrophically. Their families spent a decade in the courts. A Supreme Court ruling, a major public inquiry, and a written ministerial apology were required before the British government formally acknowledged what the families had been saying since 2004. In the streets of Basra, on the roads of Al-Amara, in the fields east of Lashkar, the Snatch met the threat it was never built for. That is not the cost of war. That is the cost of a decision.